Hey, SPC-209, we're going to see this is like the fourth time I've tried to start this. Photo booth is killing me. We'll see what happens. Hey, this is your final video of the semester. This is the final exam review. I won't be posting any more videos. If you want to go back and look at the old videos that I've posted, if you just have a desire to watch my old lectures, feel free. Just don't tell me because it creeps me out. Okay, so here's what I do with the final exam reviews. This is an opportunity. I have a bank of test questions that I update, change. I write new ones. I use old ones. And this is giving me an opportunity to tell you this is what I'm going to be looking at for possible subjects of test questions. I do this on video every time. That way people don't go, well, could you explain to me what you mean by, I don't do this. You should know this stuff already. Okay. It's in the textbook. It's in the lectures. Okay. You ready to go? And again, there's stuff I'm going to not cover here that I have explicitly told you during lectures you need to check the textbook on. Okay. You should have done that already. All right. So let's start. Chapter 1, the communication process. If you remember, we did it with the joint SPC-209-205 class. So we defined the communication process. Okay, we talked about the components. Two knowing participants, a message, channels, feedback. We talked about forms of communication, including interpersonal, intrapersonal, interpersonal, group communication, public communication, and mass communication. Okay. Then we started talking about models. We talked about Aristotle's model. We talked about Laswell's model. We talked about and how similar they were. We talked about encoding and decoding. Then we got into the real models. We got into Shannon and Weaver's linear model, the ABX model, Osgood and Schramm's interactional model, and Barnland's transactional model, and Dance's helix model. Okay? Then we talked a little bit about dialogic theory. Then we talked about communication, striving for communication competence and adaptability, appropriateness, and effectiveness. And then we talked about communication as a process, not an event. Moving to Chapter 2. I go through this really fast. You can stop and rewind if you need to. Chapter 2. We talked about communications and perception. We defined perception and we broke it down into 3 steps. Selecting, organizing, and a third step. Clearly that's not going to be on the test if I can't figure out what it is. And interpretation. Oh yeah, this is going to be important. Selection, organizing, and interpretation. In interpretation, which is the most important one, we talk about schema and schemata. Okay, schema and schemata. Okay, then we talked about how we perceived others. We talked about attribution and interpretation. We talked about we don't see events as random, but we attribute them to internal and external causes. We talked about perceiving and presenting yourself. We talked about self-concept, self-esteem, self-efficacy, and influences on self-perception. Then we talked about improving perception, and then we moved to Chapter 3, language. Okay? Remember, we defined it as language as any formal system of gestures, signs, sounds, and symbols used or conceived as a means of communicating thought. Remember, communicating thought. We talked about how language is symbolic. And a symbol is a word is a symbol that stands for things. We talked about the triangle of meaning. Remember, thought, symbol, and referent. Then we talked about denotative and connotative memories, or meanings. Denotative being dictionary, connotative meaning in context. Okay? We talked about the rules of language, which is called grammar. We talked about how to use language effectively through figurative language like simile or metaphors. We say we use language to accomplish 4 things: make observations, express thought, communicate emotions, and to meet a need. Okay? Then we talked some about how to use language ethically. And finally, we talked about being aware of implied biases built into our language for issues such as race, gender, age, ability, and sexual orientation. All right, chapter 4, nonverbal communication. You remember we started out talking about, okay. Informal, the informal definition of nonverbal communication is everything but the words you choose to use and would include the way you choose to say it, or paralinguistics, okay? We had some notes. Nonverbal communication is oftentimes more important. Nonverbal communication is more ambiguous. We believe nonverbal communication more than verbal. Nonverbal conveys meaning by reinforcing, substituting, or contradicting verbal communication. And nonverbal can be used to regulate a conversation. Remember, okay? Then we talked about the types of nonverbal communication. Kinesics, which are all movements, specific and separate from that. Head movements. Eye contact, facial expression. Haptics, okay? And then proxemics, how close you are. We talked about nonverbal communication competence, that we expect our nonverbals and verbals to be in agreement. That's called nonverbal congruence. And then we talked about, there's a large section in the book, and starting at page 44 of my book, in chapter 4, about nonverbal communication competence. I would go back and look at that. Then we talked about listening, okay? Really boil down to know the difference between hearing and listening. That'll be important. Then pay attention to the Blaine-Goss model. I love the Blaine-Goss model, okay? Then go back to the old school 4 stages: receiving, understanding, remembering, and evaluating. Okay. Then there was listening styles: people-focused, action-focused, content-focused, time-focused. And then we talked about some impediments to listening, or the types of noise. Please be up to speed on the types of noise you may encounter. And then we talked about listening competence. That's in the book. Okay, then finally in chapter 6, we got to interpersonal communication. Talk about why we study interpersonal communication. We talked about why we communicate with other people, and there were 4 reasons: to define a relationship, to gain compliance over some issue, to achieve a relationship goal, or for self-preservation or self-presentation goals. Okay? We talked about conflict and conflict management style, and they were competing, avoiding, accommodating, compromising, collaboration. Okay? We talked about the steps in negotiation: the pre-negotiation, the opening, the exploration, the bargaining, and the settlement. All right? And then we talked about self-disclosure in interpersonal communications. Okay? We do it for 2 reasons: social penetration theory and social comparison theory. Judging. Moving on. Chapter 7. Communication in relationships. Okay? We talked about first the most basic question: why do we form relationships with other people? We talked about the need for inclusion, the need for control, and the need for affection. Okay, we talked, and I told you to go look at table 7.1, the stages of a relationship. I didn't go over it, but it is important. Then we talked about social exchange theory. I will tell you, I love social exchange theory. Be versed on social exchange theory. Then we talked about friendships. We talked about types of friendships: reciprocal, associative, and receptive. Okay. We talked about why we become friends with other people. We talked about friendships across your life and how they change from adolescence to early adulthood to adulthood to your later life. We talked about families and how we define a family. And then we talked about anger. And the 2 key concepts there is anger is neither good nor bad, but violence is never accepted. Okay. Chapter 8 was on culture. We defined culture. We talked about layers of culture: national, regional, gender, generational, social, and corporate. A lot of people have a lot of issues when there's a couple of questions. There will probably be a couple of questions on layers of culture, and a lot of people get those mixed up. I would go back and review them very closely. We discussed that we develop a sense of who we are from our culture. Even if we reject that culture, that is a definition of who we are. Okay, then we talked about some specific cultural identities, including race, gender, and sexuality. All of those we discussed are variables. Even things like race and gender, they are not biological. They are how we define race, how we define culture, and how we define acceptability among the many options for sexuality. It changes with our culture as our culture changes. Okay, so please be aware of that. We talked about intercultural communication, and then we talked in great detail about cultural appropriation. Okay, then we got into the public speaking chapters, and we're gonna, we started off with chapter 9, how to select a topic. We talked about audience analysis, and I gave you some models for audience analysis. You remember demographic, psychographic, purpose-oriented. Okay, we talked about the 3 possible purposes: to attain, to inform, and to persuade. And we talked about organization. Remember, chronological, narrative order, topic order, spatial pattern, problem solution. Okay? Then we talked a little bit about informative speaking. Then we talked about persuasive speaking, and we went back to Aristotle for pathos, logos, and ethos. Know what pathos, logos, and ethos are. Okay? Just skipping over some of this stuff because I know there'll never be questions about that. We did go into persuasive, and we talked about inductive reasoning, reasoning by analogy, deductive reasoning, and then we talked about fallacies, the false analogy, the false authority, the argument ad hominem, the appeal to tradition. Be aware of those. Then we went to chapter 10, delivering the speech. And that was some from chapter 9 and some from chapter 11. We talked about performance apprehension, and you'll remember seeing something that looked about like that. I can't see the camera now, but you'll remember that, the stages of performance apprehension. We talked about the causes, biological, previous experience, method. We talked about methods of presentation, reading from a manuscript, speaking from memory, impromptu speaking, extemporaneous speaking. Okay? We talked about the voice. We talked about speaking for clarity. Yeah, okay. Moving on. Then we talked about, in chapter 13, we talked about small groups. We talked about the characteristics of a small group. How many people can be in a small group? What's the maximum number and why? We talked about group leadership. We talked about selection of a group leader is influenced by internal and external factors. I would be aware of what the difference is in those. Okay. We talked about characteristics of a group, interdependence, shared identity. We talked about small group functions. We talked about advantages of working in a small group. We talked about the phases of small group development: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Okay? And then we talked about problems: groupthink, conflict. And remember, conflict is not bad, just as long as it doesn't turn violent. Then we talked about leadership. Define the difference between leaders and leadership. We talked about how leaders are chosen. In the book, there's a list of leadership styles in chapter 14. We talked about power. We talked about different group member roles. We talked about task roles like leader, initiator, information giver. We talked about maintenance roles like supporter, harmonizer, and gatekeeper. And then we talked about disruptive roles like stage hog, clown, blocker, and fighter. We talked about group problem solving, and we talked about the steps of problem solving. Define the problem, analyze the problem, generate solutions, evaluate solutions, and then implement and assess the solution. We talked about leadership functions and problem solving, and we discussed this. Okay? Consensus, voting, compromise, and authoritarian. All right, then our last chapter, last lecture, 15 and 16. We talked about mass media. I talked a little bit about Neil Ferguson, who discussed the dynamics of networks as opposed to, why networks are more robust, why networks are stronger. Okay? We talked about the history of mass communication, and we went through 8 different steps from the 15th century to the 2000s. We talked about the functions of mass media especially before 2000. Information, interpretation, instructive, bonding, or diversionary. We talked about media as the gatekeeper. We talked about the remnants, 2000s beginning the big shift in mass culture and mass communications are beginning to break down. And what brought that about? Then we began talking about social networks, and we talked about dormant networks. We talked about branding, even in interpersonal communications, your branding. We talked about the need for self-disclosure, and we talked about the effort we now put into relationship maintenance is very, very low. Okay, all right. Probably by no later than Monday, I've already announced the date of your final. Okay, no later than Monday, I'm going to come out with it's going to be done on Blackboard. Once you start, you will have 90 minutes to complete it. You will not be able to go back and look at a question once you answer it and move forward. All that stuff will be in the announcement. I'm just giving you a heads up. But once you start the exam, the exam will go live at 9 a.m. and it will be available to you until 9 a.m. So you have until 7:30 the next morning. Well, you have until 9 o'clock. If you want to start it at 8:59 and think you can do all 40 questions in a minute, hey, good on you. Okay, but once you start, you will have 90 minutes uninterrupted minutes to complete the exam. Once you log out, you are done, and you will get whatever score you have. Okay, so our outstanding Blackboard people here on campus have given me some points that you need to know. I will post those in the announcements very soon. If you have any questions about materials, I will accept them up until the beginning of the final. When that final goes active, I am not answering your questions anymore until the final has been pulled off. If you've got, down the road, years down the road, if you have questions about interpersonal communication and would like to ask your old instructor, hey, shoot me an email. Okay, I'll be happy to continue talking to you. I don't consider this instructor thing to end when you take the final and I post your final grades. If you have questions, please come and talk to me now. The one thing I am going to request is this was an online class. Do not do what other online students have done to me and see me down by the hub and run up, come and going, Mr. McInnes, because I've never seen any of you before. And to have some strange person rushing at me, screaming my name, kind of freaks me out, okay? So walk up and say, hey, Mr. McInnes, I took your SPC-209 class. Can I speak to you for a minute? And I will be happy to talk to you. But please let me know that that's how you know me, because I'm getting old. And sometimes I think I forget things. And having you tell me I'm not forgetting you, I've never really actually met you before, would give me great comfort and solace in my later years. Okay? That's it, guys. All you got to do now is take this final. I got to grade your discussion board, and I'll take care of that. But you should. Most of y'all probably already done that already. This is the downhill swing. Just make sure you study for that final. Okay. All right. That's all I've got. Please contact me if you have any questions. Please take care of yourselves, and I will see you soon.